The CIA, they're warning that China would supply lethal weapons to Russia for its war in Ukraine, or at least that they could. That CIA Director Bill Burns telling CBS that the agency was confident that Chinese leadership was considering the move, but they stressed that a final decision had not yet been made. This comes after identical warnings last week from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. This would be in direct opposition to Beijing's public sentiments on the matter, calling for peaceful political resolution to the conflict and presenting their own peace plan proposal just on Friday. Now, for more on this, we're joined by senior correspondent Owen Alterman to break this down a little bit more. Owen, let's jump right into this. First off, the CIA has a bit of a reputation here. We can't leave that aside, but are these credible allegations? Doesn't China have too much to lose, given how entangled they are with the Western economy?
Well, first of all, Ariel, know how careful and cautious Bill Burns was in this interview when he was asked, right? He said, there's evidence that the Chinese are considering this. He says no final decision has been made, and there's no evidence that the decision has been made or is close to being made. So, and part of that paraphrase. But in any event, saying that they don't know whether the Chinese will ultimately do it, but know that the Chinese are thinking about it, so shows it's not an easy decision for the Chinese. On the one hand, the Chinese might like to see the West get a black eye in Ukraine. On the other hand, China, of course, has important trading relationships with the United States and Europe, and the Chinese might want to think twice before putting those at risk, something that also came up in that interview as well.
So I guess the big question is, who benefits in all these? What, aside from a black eye to the West, would China have to gain? I mean, certainly there's been talk of parallel economies, the BRICS nations using this as a pivotal moment, but simultaneously we've seen the Western world back itself up and say, you could actually break the BRICS nations from forming an alternate economy simply by winning the war in Ukraine and securing those resources in the Western bloc. If that's the case, can China even make any benefits if they were to support Russia?
Well, you're right. I mean, there are two elements here, right? One is the first thing we were talking about, Ariel, giving a black eye to the West, and obviously that's going to be important to Chinese policymakers. The other is the leverage within Russia. The Chinese obviously aren't going to be giving these weapons for free. The Chinese will give these weapons in return for something, and maybe that something is more Chinese influence within the Russian economy. And we've seen China build up its influence, particularly in the Russian Far East, over the last decade or two. And one would imagine that the Chinese would extract more concessions of that sort from the Russians in return for essentially helping to bail out Vladimir Putin in this war. And obviously this is an important point for the West, Ariel, because Chinese weapons, one would imagine, could make a big impact on the battlefield. Obviously, we all see how stretched the Russian military is and how much it needs help from abroad. You know, there was an interesting moment in the exchange with Bill Burns when CBS anchor Margaret Brennan asked him, why would the Chinese risk a kind of backlash with their relations with the United States and Europe to do so? And Bill Burns said, it's a good question. We're trying to deter them from doing so. And watching this with Middle Eastern eyes and listening to this with Middle Eastern ears, Ariel, you can't help but think of Iran and just how much Iran has hurt itself and its relations, especially with Europe, and any chance of entering into an Iran nuclear deal because of their decision to give lethal aid to the Russians. So one would imagine that the Chinese would have a similar risk if they were to go for that kind of move as well. Do the costs outweigh the benefits? According to Bill Burns, that's what the Chinese are considering right now.